Glad to see everyone. Glad you're here. We will pick up kind of in the middle of Hebrews where we left off last time. We'll start at 7:11 because this is where it. Again, I know a lot of his sounded or felt a bit complex, understandably, because there is just it's a complex, maybe not the right word, but it's a foreign and sophisticated argument. And actually, I'll say because it's actually not a complex argument. Once you get sort of the basic kind of ideas and systems that he's working with, the author's working with, but because it's so foreign to us and because it is a sophisticated argument, some of it takes a bit of unpacking. And so, I won't do a review of everything we said, just so we can actually get to new material. But I do want to reiterate this one point because it's about to become the thing he really hits home. Recall that we've seen, just because we've looked at it, remember, if you read through 8:1 through 5, and other stuff that we've kind of looked at before, the author envisages two temples, a heavenly temple and the earthly one. And according to chapters 8, 9, and 10, and bits of 7, the earthly temple is governed, managed, officiated by Levitical priests, and they are appointed as priests on the basis of genealogy. So you become a priest in this order if you are a Levite, right? You don't sort of purchase it. You don't get elected for it like you run for office. If you are born into a Levite family, so by clan, then you will be a priest, or someone who at least who functions in the tabernacle temple space. That's important. And so not only is that a requirement, it also, well, negatively that means if you are any other tribe, you may not officiate in this space, right? So if you are a Judahite, you cannot officiate in this space, or the earthly temple, right? But he's also mentioned, or he does eventually in chapter 8, but he's alluded to it in various ways. But in chapters 8, 9, 10, he'll talk about the heavenly temple, the temple that exists in heavenly space. It is not governed by Levitical priests. It is not officiated by Levitical priests. It is, and that is, again, this is the part that is actually not difficult. It's just that it's foreign to us. He's thinking of the two different spaces as being characterized by different materiality. This space is constituted by and governed by people who are mortal. This space is mortal space, and it is governed by humans who are mortal. This space is immortal, imperishable space. Its materiality is of a different quality. And therefore, it is governed necessarily by people who have that qualitative character. In other words, mortal space is necessarily governed by mortal things, and celestial space is necessarily governed by immortal, celestial type beings. This is why Melchizedek is regarded as a sort of heavenly celestial priest of sorts. So that's going to be relevant for what he says here in a minute, because he's then going to argue about the fact that, okay, Christ is our high priest, but you might ask, because apparently some in the community did, like, well, how could he be a priest since he's not a Levite? And so then he has to argue, well, he can be a priest, though he's not a Levite, because he's not a priest here. He's a priest here. And he got his priesthood not on the basis of a law about genealogy, which is, I'm now quoting him. He was ordained a priest not on the basis of a law concerning genealogy, but on the basis of his indestructible life. So what the author envisions is Now just imagine that I drew all that smaller and imagine these spaces. So imagine there's a being called the Son. There's the Father and the Son and the Spirit. The Son always existed. There was not a time in which this being called the Son did not exist. Hebrews 1 even describes the Son as the being through whom all things were made. So everything that exists was made by the Son, right? But then the Son became human. That human's name is Jesus. He then lived in this earthly space, was obedient, etc., died, but then was resurrected. Then got resurrected. So now, he's a human with an immortal body. And with that resurrected body, Jesus re-entered into heavenly space, such that he takes humanity, because he is human himself, into celestial space. So now he's a resurrected, immortal being, and the author's point is, because of that, he may function legitimately as a priest in this space, because he's now here and is of the same quality of the space that he regulates or rules over or rules in. And recall, because this will be important for the passage we're going to read in a minute, read 8, 1 through 4. Abby, will you get 8, 1 through 4 open and read 8, 1 through 4? And then once you get to verse 4, read it in italics.
Okay. Now the point in what we're saying is this.
Okay, actually, let's do this. Everyone listen to Abby, but look up here. Sorry, Abby. So everyone listen to Abby, but look here.
Now the point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty of heaven, a minister in the sanctuary and the true tent, which is set up not by man, but by the Lord. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Hence, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law.
All right. So he cannot be a priest here because Levites already rule here, right? Now, notice what that presumes, because this will be important for chapter 7. What does that assume? What does his argument about Christ having to be a priest in celestial space and not earthly space assume about this law and this priesthood? That he doesn't have a beginning and an end, yeah, because he's got everlasting life, etc.
They were appointed according to genealogy and Aaron.
Yeah, their genealogy and they're here, right?
But that has an end.
What?
But the Levitical priesthood has an end.
It does have an end. Has it ended yet, according to this argument? You're on the right track.
Yes, it's heading towards
It's heading toward it, but it hasn't ended yet. And this is where it's important, because it will really condition our understanding of chapter 7. If it had ended, if this priesthood had just ended already, and if the law that it governs had just ended, then it wouldn't matter if he weren't a Levite. He says he cannot be a priest on earth because these people already exist who offer according to the law. In other words, his argument about Christ's priesthood necessarily being here depends upon the assumption that the law still legitimately functions in this space. If it didn't, it wouldn't matter that he's not a Levite.
So are all priests still Levitical?
Yes, well, before the year 70. In the year 70, the temple got destroyed. So there's no priesthood that functions down here. The priesthood did it. Well, no, the priesthood didn't end. The temple got destroyed. So there's no offering, but Levites still exist. Yeah.
Can't be rebuilt because
Lots of historical and various reasons. Yeah. My point for right now is just that His argument assumes the legitimacy of the law in this space. It builds upon it. And if you're like, why are you talking about this the whole time? It's going to become important in chapter 7. All right, so now look at chapter 7, verse 11. 7:11. Now, if perfection, we've already talked about perfection, right? It's the attaining of some sort of immortal, resurrected self. We know this because earlier in Hebrews, it talks about Christ being morally perfect, and yet that at his resurrection, he was perfected, right? So if the author of Hebrews can say that Jesus is sinless, and yet also say that he got perfected, it's got to be related not to his morality, he was already sinless. It's got to be related to something else. And in context, he refers to his perfection with reference to his resurrection. In other words, Christ got perfected bodily, mortally, such that he was transformed into an immortal being. And for that reason, he can occupy this space here, right? But notice what it says. It says, if perfection could have come through the Levitical priesthood, then what further need would there have been to speak of another priest? His point is that this priesthood could not cause perfection. In other words, this Levitical priesthood, as good as it was, all it could do was offer gifts in this space. It could not transform its offerers into beings who could occupy this space. So this is like it would be like saying, like, look, first aid kits are good. They can manage a person's topical ailments right? But first aid kits cannot immortalize a person. First aid kits are good. They can manage your mortality, bandage your cuts, etc. But first aid kits cannot make you into the kind of person who will never get injured again. This is his logic. The Levitical priesthood is good, etc., but it couldn't perfect its offerers. The people for whom it offered, it could not perfect them. In other words, it couldn't resurrect them. It just wasn't given for that. This is part of the author's point, is that the law and the priesthood just simply were not given for that end. Cool? Through there? But another priesthood has arisen who can do that, because he'll go on to talk about how Christ and his offering can bring perfection on behalf of those who, participate in his offering. So look there at the hyphenated clause in 7:11. Now, if perfection had been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and then what is y'all's, Abby, what does your translation say? And then someone else if it's different.
For under it the people received the law.
Perfect. For under it the people received the law. Anything else? 7:11, the hyphenated clause.
It says for on the basis of it.
For on the basis of it, the people received the law. Yeah. So what does that mean? On that English translation, what does that hyphenated clause mean? Right, but the hyphenated clause in 7:11, what does it mean?
That the law was part of the Levitical priesthood, maybe not necessarily the Melchizedek priesthood.
Yeah, I think that's part of it.
The law was created afterwards, right?
Right. But the law was given through that priesthood, is what that translation of it says, right? Yeah, we'll get to that. I'm just asking about the meaning of the hyphenated clause. That's all I'm asking about right now, is that hyphenated clause.
We're not subject to the law because we have a different priest.
That's what he'll go on to say, but not quite. Again, all I'm asking now is everyone understanding the meaning of the hyphenated clause. For the people received the law under this priesthood is how this translates it. In other words, it's making the claim that the law, like the Mosaic law, was given through the priesthood, right? If that's your translation in mind, then what you're going to do through the rest of the chapter is you're going to assume that every time he mentions law, he's talking about the whole Mosaic law, right? Okay. It's probably not what he says. What he says in 7:11 is, oh man. All right. Let's get the... The translation makes it sound like he's talking about the whole law, for the law was received through that priesthood, right? So what he says is, for the people received legislation concerning the priesthood. He doesn't mean that the law was given through the priesthood. He says that the people received legislation about the priesthood, which makes sense for a few reasons. One, he's going to go on to talk about laws about the priesthood, either based on genealogy or not. And also, he doesn't actually use the word law in this text. He uses the verb legislated. So that's the other thing. He doesn't use the word law here. He says, for the people were legislated concerning it, is all he says. Like at the most literal level, what he says is, in Greek, is, for the people were legislated concerning it. The question is, what's the it? Well, in Greek, nouns and pronouns are feminine or Greek, or feminine, masculine, neuter, etc. And the it is feminine, and it reverts back to the previous feminine noun, which is priesthood. So what he says in this hyphenated clause is, for the people received legislation concerning the priesthood. In other words, he's not talking about, in this big grand scheme, the Mosaic law in 7:11 following. He's about to be talking about the legislation about priesthood. Which, the reason I'm going off on this is because then it makes sense of the rest of 7, in which he talks about the fact that there are laws that require priests to be Levites. In other words, he goes on to talk about legislation concerning the priesthood. Which also then means that the rest of 7, when it talks about the commandment or the law, it's referring to the commandment concerning the priesthood, not the law writ large. And the reason that will make sense is because then what he's saying is, look, the legislation that requires him to be a Levite has been nullified for Jesus because he's not in the space that law governs. He's in this space. In other words, the author of Hebrews in chapter 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 is not saying the law has been nullified or set aside. He's saying, in the case of Jesus, who now works here, the legal requirement that required he be a Levite is not applicable because he's here.
Just like after someone's death, they don't have to remain unmarried. The widow doesn't have to remain unmarried because their death changes the law.
Or their ontological status changes whether the law obligates them. And that's different, because the author of Hebrews is not saying that the law has been nullified. Remember, that's why I had Abby read 8:4 in italics. 8:4 requires that the law still govern this space, or else it wouldn't preclude Jesus from being a priest here. He says if Jesus were on earth, he couldn't be a priest. That assumes that the law still legitimately prohibits him from being one. In other words, Hebrews 8:4, the argument is that the law still legitimately legislates and governs this space. But, big parentheses, he's not in this space. He's in this space. So he's not talking about the nullification of the Mosaic law. He's talking about the setting aside of a commandment that he be a Levite. In the case of Jesus, that's been set aside. Why? Not because the law's been nullified, but because he transcends the space that the law legislates. So I'll say that last part again. It's for other Hebrews, it's not that the law has been nullified, it's that Christ has transcended the state that the law legislates. The law legislates mortals. Jesus is not a mortal. Not a mortal. The law governs mortals. That's kind of like the big grand presupposition of Hebrews and other Jewish texts I can talk about in a second. The law governs mortals. Jesus isn't one. Questions through there?
Are you reluctant to ask us?
I feel like I said that a lot, so I feel bad because it feels like it was really repetitive, but I also am like hyper conscious that it's like probably a new reading of this passage and a new supposition, so just, going slow on it in case you have questions about it. Yeah, Dan.
Melchizedek, if he was a heavenly priest,
Yeah.
why was he still a priest down here?
Well, it doesn't actually say he was serving as a priest, right? It just says he was a priest, and he happens to be down here, right? And actually, I'm glad you asked because earlier I realized I had misspoken, and I almost corrected myself. I was like, it's not a big deal. But then your question actually noticed it. Earlier I said if you're celestial, you can't be here, and vice versa. I think what I would want to say is if you're earthly, you can't be here. I don't think it would preclude, right, celestial, because he's a Judahite, which is an earthly clan. No, Jesus. Jesus is a Judahite, right? Jesus is a Judahite, which is an earthly clan, but that makes him a legitimate heir of the kingdom, right? Because he's from the line of tribe of Judah. And his Judahiteness doesn't go away once he's enthroned. So my point is that I shouldn't have said that you can't be here if you're doing heavenly stuff, or if you're like a heavenly being, you can't do anything here. It's just the reverse is the case. Like according to his argument, right? I'm sure you can find a text that would make it work in, but.
So the tithes offered by Abraham to Melchizedek, how come tithes weren't offered to Jesus after that?
Um,
After he died?
like, how come we?
I understand all of that because it's not unnecessary.
Yeah, no. It's like in other words, the question is why don't we sort of give tithe to Jesus?
I guess while he was here, he didn't necessarily have priestly duties, even though he was a priest.
Mm-hmm.
He was given the tithe by Abraham.
Yeah,
Because there's
a tenth of his spoils. Yeah.
I guess that's all I mean.
Yeah.
So is that something that of an order of Melchizedek priest should get?
It doesn't say, like, the author of Hebrews never sort of mobilizes that particular argument. At the end, in 13, he does talk about giving the praise of our lips as thanksgiving offerings to God, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. So I do think that whether Hebrews, I'm sure the author had something in mind. The text itself doesn't give us a ton to go with, but early Christian theologians read with the grain of Hebrews to argue that what we do as Christians, etc., is our active sacrifice toward Christ as our high priest.
So he wasn't a priest until he was resurrected.
According to, yeah, I think so. According to 721.
So after that resurrection, then the spoils should be given to the
Yeah,
priest.
right. Yeah.
And that's what we should be doing.
Yeah. Yep. Other questions?
Sounds like the main point is that 11 is about the priesthood.
Yeah.
The law.
Yeah, for sure.
The big law.
Yeah, that is
So that the rest of his argument is
when it
the priesthood.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that when it refers to laws and commandments, it's referring to laws about priesthood, etc. Because not only that's the argument in chapter 7. The rest of the argument in chapter 7 is Jesus' priesthood versus the Levitical one. This one's governed by laws concerning genealogy. This one isn't. Let's just read the rest of it. Well, actually, let me check the time. Okay, let me read some of it now, and now with that in place, maybe you might hear it differently. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for this people received legislation concerning that Levitical priesthood, what further need would there have been to speak of another priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, rather than the one according to the order of Aaron. Aaron's a Levite. For when there is a change in priesthood, and what must he be talking about? Yeah, Levitical and Melchizedekian, but that's also translated into this, a spatial point, because Levites govern here, Melchizedekian ones govern here, right? This is his point. That's his point in 8, that we have such a high priest ministering in the true heavenly temple, etc. These offer worship in the shadow, the copy of the heavenly one, but Christ, our high priest, ministers in this space, right? So the change in priesthood is both a change from Levitical to Melchizedekian, but it also refers to a spatial, it maps onto a spatial change. So when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. Well, again, if the legislation he's talking about is the legislation concerning priesthood, he's referring to a change in the law about priesthood, which is what he's about to talk about. The fact that now the one of whom these things are spoken, Christ, belonged to another tribe from which no one has ever served at the altar, the earthly altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. In other words, Moses didn't give any legislation concerning this, like Jesus' priesthood, because it's of a different order, right? It's even more obvious when another priest arises, resembling Melchizedek, one who's become a priest not through a law concerning genealogy, but through the power of his resurrection, his indestructible life. That's how he became a priest. 7:15. So can y'all see, like, the next points of the next things he's talking about are legislation about the priesthood according to the Mosaic law. Moses didn't give any legislation concerning the Melchizedekian priest. He only gave legislation concerning the Levitical one. And so the fact that he's not a Levitical one but a Melchizedekian one implies there's necessarily a change in legislation. In other words, a legislation concerning priesthood. These ones become priests through a law of genealogy.
Consequently, the law was handed to Moses by the Son.
I don't know about consequently, but yes, I think he would affirm that the that it originated from here and came down here. Yes, yeah, for sure, yeah.
To Moses about the Levites.
Yeah.
Not about himself.
Yes, yeah, right, exactly. That's right.
He's not subject to his law that he created.
He's not subject to the law that, he is subject to it once he becomes human, right? Mm-hmm. Like he can't say, well, I can just hate my neighbor, right? But he is, it legitimately is given for this space, yeah. So there's an interesting, several interesting traditions, actually, that, James, that your comment made me think of, and then we'll go. And I'm going to mention them. They might sound, actually, no, they're not confusing at all. They're actually very easy to understand, and they help kind of illustrate this point. So you'll know there's a tradition in the Judaism of this period that when God gave the law to Moses, angels were also present, right? You see that. It's mentioned, right, in Galatians when Paul says that the law was handed over to Moses, mediated by angels, or it's mentioned in Stephen's speech in Acts 7 that the law was given to you through angels, etc. And it's probably implicit in just the text itself, the fact that when Yahweh descends to the top of Mount Sinai to give the law, he's surrounded by all these, other beings. And so there was a tradition that angels were present at the giving of the law to Moses, right? So they witnessed it. They stand around and watched it. Now, there's this interesting Psalm 8, which says, what are mortals that you're mindful of them? The Son of Man, that you created him, and you set him a little while lower than the angels. In fact, right, Hebrews actually quotes it. In rabbinic material, sometimes that psalm gets placed on the lips of angels as if it's like almost like a complaint. Like, God, what are humans that you're mindful of them? In other words, like, we were created first. We're superior ontological beings. What are humans that you're mindful of them? Right? And then they bring it up again at the giving of the law to Moses. They observe him giving this awesome gift, the law, to Moses, and they say, God, what are humans that you're mindful of them? Why would you give them such an awesome law? And then God turns to Moses and says, Moses, you answer them. And he says, what? And he says, well, touch my throne and I'll give you power to answer them. He says, okay. So then Moses thinks about it for a second. He goes, oh yeah. So then he addresses the angels and says, angels, what does the law say? And then they start quoting it. It says, well, it says, oh God, when you rescued your people out of Egypt, da-da-da. And then Moses says, angels, were y'all rescued from Egypt? They say, well, no. They say, okay, well then the law wasn't given to you. This didn't happen to you. And what else does the law say? And they say, well, it says when a man dies in a tent. He goes, okay, hold on. Do you guys die in tents? You're like, well, no. You go, okay, well then the law wasn't given to you. And he goes down the line and he asks moral questions like, hey, the law says, don't murder. Do you guys murder? And they're like, well, no. He goes, all right, well then the law wasn't given to you. And then the other text about impurity. Like, when a man becomes impure, when a man has sex with his wife, when a man, whatever, when a woman menstruates, when a woman gives birth, when a man dies in a tent, da-da-da. And then Moses goes to the angel and says, does any of that stuff happen to you? And they say, no. He goes, all right, well, then the law wasn't given to you because you are angels and therefore you're not legislated by this law. In other words, again, goes back to the point I said a minute ago, they are beings that occupy a space that is not governed by the law because the law was given to govern mortal space. And as mortal space, it governs conditions, mortality, that angels simply transcend. So laws about impurity, etc., just don't pertain to beings who never become impure, right? This is a very common tradition in rabbinic texts. And I think others is not like a novel Paul Sloan argument like others have said what I'm about to say. But I think it's implicit in this kind of argument as well. It's not that the law has been nullified, it's that Jesus has transcended the space that the law legislates. Yep.
Angels have free will, but they don't have a law.
Well, they don't have they still have requirements in the sense that they ought to, obey God, etc. It's more that they're making a technical argument about, does the law of Moses legislate them? And the answer is no, because it gives all sorts of commands and legislates all sorts of conditions that the angels transcend. Because they're celestial beings, they don't ever become impure, they don't ever die. So they wouldn't need commandments that legislated that, right? It's sort of is the argument, is the idea at stake. No. I mean, like what angels are you talking about? Okay, yeah. But that would be different than ritual. Yeah, that would be different than ritual impurity, right? Ritual impurity is not the same thing as sin. So they don't become impure in the way that mortal humans do, right?
Talk about the heavenly tabernacle, though, and I thought they did sacrifices of some sort.
Yeah. But presumably, again, this is a good example of, I don't know, we don't have text about this, but it'd be a good case of presumably according to an alternative legislation, right? One that governs that space and not this one, right? My point isn't that the angels have no requirements. It's that the very technical point that's being argued in those rabbinic texts is these angels are not governed by this law.
Maybe we don't know about them because they don't apply to us.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. No, precisely, yeah. Actually, the one interesting point that they raise is, so what do y'all have any requirements? And Moses in one text answers, yes, the law that governs both humans and angels is, you're never going to guess it. Actually, you will guess it because love your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Those always have to be kept whether you're heaven or earth. Okay. It is crazy, except it makes perfect sense of why Jesus and the apostles, who are so convinced that resurrection's on the horizon and heaven and earth about to be one, that these are the two commands that will always obligate, right? You can never not do these two commands. There will come a time when other commandments simply cease to obligate. Not because the laws all of a sudden realize, oh, actually that was silly. It's just that we will have transcended a state that the law no longer legislates. Yep. Father in heaven, thanks for this day. Thanks for this time together. Thanks for this chance to talk together, read together, learn together. We love you, Lord. We ask that this upcoming time of worship be glorifying to you and edifying to us. We lift up again the requests made earlier. You know them better than we, and you can meet those needs better than we. We love you, Lord, and trust you. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.